Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our online audience who is joining from all over the world. Welcome to today's seminar on exploring norms and values as an evidence-based strategy for preventing violence against children. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jody van der Heyde. I coordinate the INSPIRE working group in the Justice and Violence Prevention Program at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. I will be chairing our conversation today. For today, please keep your microphones and cameras off until we have reached the question and answer portion for today's event. The question and answer session will be conducted using both the chat function and the raise hand function in your Zoom application. Should you wish to raise your hand, kindly click on the reactions button to access the raise hand function. Please note that we will evaluate this event using a poll. The evaluation is completely anonymous and helps us to present better events in the future. Kindly do take a moment to complete it. It will be launched following the presentation portion for today's event. As we wait for the final participants to connect to their audio, we kindly remind you to please keep your microphones muted and your cameras turned off until we reach the Q&A portion. Kindly note that since this is a public event being broadcast live on Facebook and YouTube, Chatham House rules do not apply. This year, the Institute for Security Studies, the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, and the INSPIRE Working Group will jointly host a series of 7 webinars on INSPIRE, the 7 strategies to ending violence against children. INSPIRE is the leading evidence-based technical package for supporting countries in preventing and responding to violence against children. And I will be sharing links and resources to INSPIRE in the chat throughout the event. We will be hosting an INSPIRE webinar every month from now until the end of the year, so please be on the lookout for those. For today, we are focusing on norms and values. Interventions that focus on transforming norms and values are designed to strengthen attitudes and beliefs that support nonviolent, respectful, nurturing, and positive gender-equitable relationships for children and adolescents. Changing attitudes and norms in society is an important part of preventing violence against children. Doing so often involves transforming deeply ingrained social and cultural norms and behaviors, in particular the idea that some forms of violence are not only normal, but justifiable. While this work is certainly challenging, it is possible, and there are many successful examples of this. The potential effects of working to change norms and values include more favorable beliefs towards gender equity and gender-equitable division of labor, more favorable attitudes towards non-violent approaches to parental discipline, and of course, greater recognition of what constitutes abusive behavior towards intimate partners and children. We are very grateful to have 4 experts with us today who will share their insights and experiences in designing and implementing strategies, interventions, and programs to transform norms and values. Although the 3 presentations are quite different from each other and they are from different parts of the world, we want to showcase that norms and values can be transformed in a number of different ways. We really intend for this webinar series to focus on learnings around INSPIRE and violence against children. So the objective of this webinar is to showcase global approaches to strengthening norms and to specifically focus on lessons learned, how challenges were overcome, and key ingredients for successful interventions. We will be together for the next hour and a half, and we really intend for the next 90 minutes to be a discussion, and we really encourage engagement from the audience. In terms of how we will structure the conversation, each panelist will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. After our final speaker, I will open the floor to a larger Q&A session with the audience. Please feel free to use the chat in the meantime to pop your comments, questions, and reflections throughout the event. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speakers. It is my pleasure to introduce Christine Colby-Stewart, who is a child protection specialist at UNICEF, focused on the prevention of violence against children and violence against women. In her current role, she is leading UNICEF's efforts to integrate social and behavioral change-informed approaches within policy and programming to prevent violence against women and children. She represents UNICEF within the Global Initiative to Support Parents and the Technical Working Group for Inspire. She is also UNICEF's agency focal point for the Spotlight initiative. Alongside her, it is my pleasure to introduce Alessandra Guedes, who is the Gender and Development Manager at UNICEF Innocenti, the Global Office of Research and Foresight. For the last 30 years, she has worked in the fields of sexual and reproductive health and rights, violence prevention, international development, and public health. She joined Innocenti in 2019 as the Gender and Development Manager to lead a research program focusing on the gender dimensions of child protection, with a particular emphasis on addressing the connections between violence against women and violence against children. Thank you very much, Alessandra and Christine. Please go ahead when you are ready. Alessandra and Christine will be sharing on UNICEF's Gender Transformative Child Protection Strategy and approach to social and behavioral change. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Jody. I'm just going to give a second for Alessandra to bring our slides up. Thank you, and thank you for the warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As Jody mentioned, Alessandra and I are presenting on UNICEF's strategic approach to shifting norms and values to prevent violence against children. So as Jody mentioned, this is the N in the Inspire strategy and fits within a larger webinar series that's being led on the overall package. So great pleasure to be with you today. Next slide, please, Alessandra. We've been asked to talk about UNICEF's approach to the prevention of violence against girls, boys and women, which has undergone some strategic changes and emphasis in recent years as our understanding about how to tackle the underlying social and gender norms driving violence has evolved. So as part of today's session, we'll cover the role that evidence has played in steering our approach, the role that UNICEF's approach and support to social and behaviour change has played, and finally we'll offer some reflections on what we've learned in the journey we've been on in UNICEF. Next slide, please. So we wanted to begin by sharing UNICEF's current strategy for child protection, which, as Jody mentioned, is a gender transformative child protection strategy. It was finalised in 2021 and it runs up to 2030. The purpose of this strategy is to provide a clear vision and strategic framework for UNICEF's work in child protection for the decade to 2030, whilst also allowing flexibility for the work to be led by country and regional offices and to be responsive to local needs. The vision of this strategy, which is centred in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is a world where all children are free from violence, exploitation, abuse, neglect and harmful practices. The goals of the strategy are taken, of course, primarily from the Sustainable Development Goals for child protection, and the primary focus is on prevention. So UNICEF's ambition is to scale up evidence-based prevention approaches to population level, including in the adoption of transformative norms and values. And we've just included these red pins here, so you can see how we've positioned change strategies like community engagement and social and behaviour change, which are so critical to driving positive behaviours and norms change to protect children from violence, exploitation and abuse. And these hooks are really very important. They allow for a diverse range of programmatic approaches to flourish that address the cognitive, social, economic and structural determinants of rights violations and behaviours, including, but not limited, of course, to transforming harmful norms. Next slide, please. So in terms of our approach to the prevention of violence, which is, really the most egregious of rights violations, there is a paradigm shift taking place. And this is comprised of three elements. Firstly, as I mentioned, there's this primary focus on prevention of violence, which is set out in the child protection strategy. The ambition is to scale up evidence-based prevention approaches to population level to reach everyone who needs them. So over the course of the strategic plan implementation period, the child protection sector expects to see an increasing proportion of resources going towards preventing violence and thereby reducing the recourse to remedial responses. Secondly, although it's third here on this slide, UNICEF's child protection sector has committed to operating at the intersections of violence against children and violence against women. So child protection will therefore focus on interventions that address the common risk factors for violence against girls, boys, and women, and those interventions that have the potential to break the intergenerational transmission of violence. And Alessandra will speak a little more to this shortly. But this is precisely to do with issues related to norms and values that this session is about. Alessandra will reflect more on this, but it reflects our increasing understanding that violence against children and violence against women often co-occur, and that these forms of violence are driven in part by shared norms rooted in patriarchy that tend to condone and perpetuate this behaviour. So social and behaviour change comes into this, the third pillar here, because it's the mechanism by which we can address those common risk factors for violence against girls, boys, and women. UNICEF is committed to making the best use of the social and behavioural sciences to tackle the root causes of violence against children and violence against women. And this includes harmful social and gender norms that are perpetuated and really reinforced by power differentials based on age and sex. I'll go into a bit more detail on the role of SBC in violence prevention, but I am first just going to hand over to Alessandra to talk us through some of the evidence that UNICEF in Entrenched has been responsible for generating and aggregating and reviewing to support these various strategic shifts within UNICEF at large. Over to you, Alessandra.
Thanks, Christine. Okay. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here with you. And what I was asked to do is to talk a little bit about how UNICEF has used evidence to move us along this process of addressing the three priorities that Christine just mentioned. And so I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that UNICEF and UNICEF colleagues, particularly those colleagues who are working on the front line at the country level, have been on this journey for a long time. And they have been seeing at country level, as they're responding and to the needs of children, the different ways in which violence against children and violence against women intersect, and in particularly how gender inequality contributes to both forms of violence. So what we have done with the evidence is bring in that knowledge, condense it, synthesize it, and help us see how it applies in terms of changes to UNICEF's programming. So the first effort that we did was to produce a paper that looked at the gender dimensions of violence against children and violence against adolescents. And this was a discussion paper that helped shape our child protection strategy, but also our gender action plan. And we showed how UNICEF had different opportunities within its own programming to broaden its approach to address the gender dimensions of violence, and in particularly to look at how violence against children and violence against women intersect. Then, in collaboration with two academic institutions, we carried out two systematic reviews. One of them looked at the co-occurrence of violence against children and violence against women in the home and tried to identify shared risk factors across those forms of violence, because obviously if we are able to identify shared risk factors and modify them through interventions such as the ones that Christine will discuss, then we are able to prevent both forms of violence simultaneously. And then most recently, we published a systematic review that looked at those interventions that, whether they were designed to reduce both forms of violence or not, they measured reductions in both violence against children and violence against women. And that was done with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And we went further into trying to understand what was the mechanism of action that those interventions had modified to be able to impact those forms of violence. In other words, was it by reducing depression amongst women? Was it by reducing economic stress, and so forth. And we will place those links in the chat for you. We're also working at the country level to try to understand the extent to which countries and governments are or are not looking at these issues in coordinated ways. And we have a 3-country study going on in the Middle East and North Africa region. And we've been carrying out a whole number of webinars like this one to call attention to these issues. And most recently, we also published with Equimundo and the Prevention Collaborative a series of evidence briefs that shows us how to adapt parenting programs so that they are gender transformative and are able to address both violence against children and violence against women. And we'll be organizing a pre-conference workshop on that at the next Sexual Violence Research Initiative Forum. Over to you, Christine.
Thanks, Alessandra. Next slide, please. So alongside this really incredible and growing evidence base, our analysis of data generated from UNICEF country offices shows us that the drivers of violence are often more complex than our programming has traditionally anticipated. This data here that I'm showing, I hope you can see it okay, is about physical punishment and focused here on the Latin America region, and Latin America and Caribbean, but it's consistent across this region and really evident the world over. And here we're seeing that children experience violent discipline, even though their mothers don't necessarily believe it's a necessary form of discipline, meaning that the practice continues even though individual support for the behaviour has eroded. And we need to do more research to understand what's driving this. But there are multiple possibilities, including that despite the knowledge and information that caregivers have, they continue to use violent discipline because of their perceptions of what others do or think is acceptable, i.e. that there's a prevailing social norm at play, or that despite feeling and knowing that physical punishment is an unnecessary form of discipline, they may lack the skills to parent differently, which would point to that P in the INSPIRE strategy for parenting support being needed, or maybe simply that some of these mothers are themselves experiencing violence in the home, which we know from other forms of evidence increases the likely incidence of violence against children. And we can program around these realities, but we do need to know what's going on. And undertaking research to develop a more nuanced understanding of the barriers to positive parenting is a core contribution of SPC to the prevention of violence against girls, boys and women. And we see it as critical to effective programming, and it indicates that this kind of data indicates to us that simply giving people increased information to improve their awareness, for example, is unlikely to eradicate violence against children and violence against women. Next slide, please. The increased use and application of the social and behavioural sciences in UNICEF in child protection and beyond is perhaps first and foremost a recognition that UNICEF is in the business of changing behaviours. So everything we do, from improving nutrition to promoting immunisation to increasing contraceptive use, requires a behaviour change, and the prevention of violence against girls, boys and women is no exception. So, increasing birth registration, stopping girls marrying early, ending violent discipline, these issues all require a behaviour change. And for that reason, as an organisation, we recognise that we need to get better at understanding why people do what they do. Next slide, please, Alessandra. So our approach to SPC really recognises that people are not rational actors. They're also emotional, they're influenced by their context, and especially by those that they live and interact with. So what's happening around them matters as much as what they think themselves. So a more realistic and comprehensive framework for behaviour change should really start by considering these broad categories of drivers. So as you can see here on the slide, psychology, which describes, of course, the internal thoughts and processes that influence individual decision making, our personal attitudes, interests, biases, knowledge and past experiences. Secondly, sociology, which describes the power dynamics that impact individuals and communities. And that includes the social influences and harmful social and gender norms that we're talking about today. And thirdly, environmental factors, which describe the large-scale institutions, policy, and communications environments that people and communities operate in. And when it comes to the perpetration of violence, people aren't weighing the costs and benefits from a self-interested perspective to then make a thoughtful and rational decision on the best path of action. And we know that providing them with the right information will rarely translate into a sort of logical choice as perhaps has been understood in more conventional models of human behaviour. So we know that people are also emotional, they're influenced by their context, and especially by those that they live and interact with on a daily basis. So what's happening around them matters as much as what they think themselves. So our approach here is really recognising that we needed a more realistic and comprehensive framework for behaviour change, and that we needed to start by considering these three broad categories or drivers. Next slide, please, Alessandra. I think I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, but really just to say that this sort of SBC lens and what's being shown here on the slide enables us to identify these different drivers at the kind of individual, social and environmental level. And these are the kinds of frameworks that we use in order to think about addressing the drivers of violence in a systemic way. And I think I'll just say, I mean, of course, this is not a straightforward approach. It's not a cookie cutter. It doesn't result in a cookie cutter model of programming, and it's often not the cheapest or the easiest solution. It's really predicated on the understanding that well-targeted investments are better than cheaper or poorly targeted investments, and that we have to follow the evidence and keep innovating in order to make progress towards the SDGs. So we've come a long way, but we still face manifold challenges. Alessandra is going to walk us through some of those challenges and what we've learned before we open up to questions. Over to you, Alessandra.
Thanks, Christine. And so I'm focusing a little bit on how we've done so far vis-a-vis addressing the intersections between violence against children and violence against women, which of course are one of the intersections is around norms change. And so I think it's important to recognize that I think we've come a long way, and I don't think I'm alone in thinking that, but there's still quite a long way to go. And what we are focusing on at the moment is how to operationalize in our programs and in the policies that we support this evidence that has been generated primarily at global and regional level. And one of the things that has been key for us in moving this agenda forward has been consultation, both internally, not just within the child protection colleagues, but also with colleagues who are working in areas that are related to child protection, whether they are early childhood development or health or education. And we have also been very intentional in terms of consulting external colleagues and experts to validate all of the evidence that we've been producing, and also to help us think about how to operationalize that in terms of our programming. And that's the case, for example, in the gender transformative parenting briefs that I've just mentioned, which were produced collaboratively with Equimundo and Prevention Collaborative. And we understanding that there may be interventions for which we have a better evidence base, we have tried to identify what might be the best entry points as we move forward. And parenting has been identified as one of them, as has social and behavior change. And now what we are moving towards is generating more targeted evidence, targeted not only in terms of the interventions that we're trying to modify, but also making them very adequate for our own staff to use. Of course, we believe that it's also going to be relevant to other colleagues from outside of UNICEF, but the evidence briefs, for example, that we're generating now, they use as a starting point our own programming in our own staff to help us think about how to change those interventions and modify them so that they are able to address both violence against children and violence against women. And we've undertaken also a series of collaborations at the global and the regional levels. We have this country study, 3 country studies in the MENA region. We've also worked together with our East Asia and Pacific regional office to look at opportunities to address both forms of violence in an integrated way. And again, we'll put those in the chat for you. And established partnerships with key organizations, not just within the UN system, such as WHO, UN Women, UNFPA, but also with civil society organizations and academic institutions. And I think without dampening our enthusiasm, I will say that we only need to be looking at the news to realize that gains in the area of women's rights, girls' rights, and gender equality are quite fragile. So while we move ahead, we are also very mindful of trying to hold on to the gains that we have made so far. So watch us and join us in this journey forward.
Thank you very much, Christine and Alessandra, for that great presentation. I'm sure there are many questions and comments, but if I could please request you just hold onto those or pop them in the chat in the meantime. I really liked how you said that we can have information about knowing that corporal punishment is wrong, but that's not enough to change your behavior. And so there's something else going on there that we need to address. So thank you so much for that. I think, yeah, please pop your questions and comments in the chat, and I think we can move right on to our second presentation for today. It is my pleasure to introduce Deborah Tayo Akapo, the Head of Programs at the Gender Studies and Human Rights Documentation Center in Ghana. Deborah is a gender, feminist, and social development specialist advocating for the promotion of women's rights and gender inequality. She has more than 20 years programming experience in prevention and response to gender-based violence, advocacy, forced child labor, and child protection. Her work has also entailed supporting, complementing, and restructuring existing structures on national, regional, and global levels, especially around gender and gender-based violence mainstreaming, sexual exploitation and abuse and harassment, social norms and behavioral change, to name a few. So Deborah is with us, and I think she is having some slight connectivity issues, so she will keep her camera off. However, hopefully she will be able to turn it on at some point. Deborah will be sharing about the Combat program. So Deborah, when you are ready, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jody. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. As Jody said, because of internet connectivity issues, I'll be putting off my camera and then I'll speak without the camera. So please, this is just me. If the camera goes off, at least you got the opportunity to see my face. Thank you very much. Okay, so I work with the Gender Studies and Human Rights Documentation Center based in Ghana. And basically, the Gender Center, what we try to do is work towards the protection and promotion of women's rights, women and girls' rights in Ghana. And my organization was established 28 years ago. The Gender Center happened to be one of the first organizations in Ghana that conducted the first ever study, that is research, on violence against women and children at a time where Ghana as a country had begun talking about violence. And the whole concept and perception was that it was a foreign concept that was being introduced into the country. And so there was a need to gather evidence to show that there was actually violence against women and children happening in Ghana. And so the Gender Center was the first organization that conducted a nationwide research. And it was based on the findings of this research that we came up with an intervention called the Combat Intervention. It is a rural response system that was developed by the Gender Center to ensure that communities are able to respond effectively to violence against women and girls. The Combat Intervention, as I said, is implemented specifically in rural communities. That was because when the research was conducted, what we found out was that a lot of interventions for violence was happening in the cities. But then when it came to the rural areas, when people are being abused, there were no intervention spaces for them, being that a lot of the state institutions and civil society organizations that were working in this area were mostly based in the urban areas. And so the Gender Center, as a result of the findings, which showed that there was a need to have a coordinated rural response that could respond effectively to violence against women and girls and children, the combat intervention was put in place. So the combat intervention is implemented by men and women from the communities who are selected and trained on various types of violence. They are trained on family laws. They are trained on conflict resolution, advocacy, counseling, and support with referrals to relevant state agencies. And when I talk about state agencies, I'm referring to the police. Fortunately, the Ghana Police Service has got a specialized unit called the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit, where people are supposed to send cases of violence to seek redress. We also have the social welfare. We have the state hospitals. And then we have the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice, called SHRAJ in Ghana, that supports victims who report cases. So the combat intervention, what we start with is go into a community, speak to the leadership of the community. And in Ghana, that would be the traditional and religious leaders. Traditional leaders because they are the custodians of customs and culture in Ghana. And the cultures and customs and traditional practices in Ghana are what entrenches, abuse or violence against women and children. And so there is a need to start the entry point with the community leaders, introduce the project to them, explain to them what the project is all about. And then we go in with a permission that is granted to the Gender Center. We go in and we meet the community as a whole. And during the community meeting, we explain to them what the project is all about. Then they would select 3 men and 3 women per community. And these 3 men and 3 women will be taken through 2 weeks intensive training where their capacities are built to understand what gender is all about and how gender has played a role in how society sees male and female and the responsibilities that are ascribed to them. And then we also explain to them what violence is, the types, the consequences, the effects. We take them through family laws, which are the Domestic Violence Act of Ghana. We take them through the Children's Act. We take them through the Marriage Act. We take them through interstate succession law, and then we take them through the Wills Act. These 5 laws are called the family laws. So we take them through these laws for them to have an understanding. And then we also build their capacity in terms of alternative dispute resolution. We build their capacity, and also we build their capacity to understand how they can play the role of being the link between the communities and the state agencies. And so after they have gone through the training, they go back into their communities and offer support services. We go integrate them into their communities and they begin to work. And so they become like role models in the communities where people would refer cases to them, report incidents of abuses to them. And then they would in turn sit on the cases. For the ones that are beyond them, the combats have got limitations in terms of how they can respond. So in cases of rape, defilement, assault that presents in injuries with cutlass wounds, acid being poured on a partner and all of that, those are cases they don't handle. Those are criminal cases. So the combat will refer those cases to the Domestic Violence and Victim Support Unit of the Ghana Police Service. Naturally, a lot of people are afraid of interaction with the police. And so this is where the combat comes in to make sure that there's a smooth transferal of the case from the community to the police, accompany the victim to the police to report the incident. And for the past 25 years, this intervention has been implemented across various regions in Ghana and various communities. In 2018, the UK Heyde, that is DFID, decided to do an intervention assessment of this intervention to see how well it has worked. And the findings that came from this study was that, of course, these are findings we already knew, but there is always the need to give an evidence base to this findings. And one of the findings that came out, interestingly, and it's something we have always known from the beginning, because when we started the combat intervention, we realized that when we go into the communities and we have spoken to the parents and everything, the women and the men at the community meetings, the way our setup is, you wouldn't really have a lot of children attending the community meetings. And so there wasn't a space for the children to air their views. And when we realized that, we decided to add another intervention, which we called the peer educated system, where we go into schools and we form gender clubs in the schools. And so normally what we will do is that when when we go into the communities, the first thing we do is to visit the schools, have interactions with the children, and based on the discussions and conversations that go on there, we go back to the communities and have meetings with them and talk about the issues that the children have raised. That was because when we did the study, and we did the first implementation of the combat intervention, we realized the intersectionality between violence against women and violence against children. And this actually came out even in the findings of the research that was conducted. And the intersectionality that was realized was that girls who were brought up in homes where they saw their mother or they saw their auntie or cousins who are females being abused, ended up endorsing abuse as a way of life for they themselves. And so they never saw anything wrong with abuse and saw it as a way of relationship within, an intimate partner environment. And so for them, it was good. And for the men, for the boys, what we saw was that they ended up perpetrating the same kind of abuse when they are outside the home. So this was even evident in their relationships in school environments, how they treated the girls, how they spoke to them, the condescending nature in which they felt that girls should be subjected to one form of abuse. So they transferred what they had learned from the home into the school environment. And so that was why we realized that there was a need to have a relationship. Cultural-wise, you can't have children speaking where parents are or where adults are gathered. So you can't bring the children into the meeting if you want people to listen to you and for you to make a headway. So that's why we created the school system, where we go to the schools, have conversations with the children, get a sense of what is going on in the home, how it's affecting them, what they think the issues are, and then we come back into the community at a community meeting, and we have a conversation with parents, with traditional and religious leaders who are gathered, and say, look, whatever is going on in the home is affecting the children. Your son goes to school, feels that it is right to smack, his fellow classmate who is a girl, feels it is right to talk down on the girl, feels it is right to tell the girl to shut up when conversations are going on, because this is what they see. And so the school system has been a part. So they go hand in hand. Everywhere we have the combat intervention in the community, we have the schools program beside it, so that at the end of the day, we have a holistic approach towards resolving issues of violence against women and children. And so when David did the intervention assessments, impact assessments, they realized the results were telling for themselves. So there was a reduction in violence from, almost half. what we did with the defeat impact assessment was we had a control community and an intervention community. So within the control community, not much was done with them, but in the where we implemented the combat study was done to see what the changes had been in the and the results spoke for themselves. So now
Deborah
has worked to shift. As I said from the beginning, we are as yes.
Deborah, your audio.
I can hear you.
Okay, your audio.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, we can hear you. Your audio is breaking off a bit, but I think you're good now. You can continue.
Okay. So as I was saying, when I started the presentation, I talked about the cultural and the social cultural norms and practices that define the relationships within communities in Ghana, and how the combat intervention has worked to shift those norms. It takes to the community. We rather try to open the eyes of the community through the combat members. So first of all, the combat members, because of the training they have received, will now go back and talk about gender with their communities and talk about the structures within the communities that further infringe the rights of women and children. So they will talk about the cultural practices that go on in those communities, cultural practices like, okay, a girl child should not go to school, rather spend money on the boy child going to school. They will talk about cultural practices like widowhood rights. They will talk about cultural practices like taking away property from a widow and her children when the husband passes away. They would talk about, they will identify the various cultural practices and address them and try to explain to the community how the structures, how the social cultural norms have affected the way the society has functioned with regards to relationships between men and women and children within the home. And so when this is done and they begin to go on with the other interventions, you realize that
Deborah, you have frozen on our side and your audio is completely silent. Can you hear us?
people now begin to speak out.
Okay.
People now begin to talk. You see, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes. Could we can hear you. You have about 3 minutes left for your presentation, Deborah.
The weather changes, there is a bit of internet connectivity issues. But can you hear me now?
Yes, I think maybe if you turn your camera off, it might be a bit better.
Yes, okay. Because the combat intervention is community-led, it made it much more easier to relate the issues within the community to how they can prevent violence against women and girls. So we were not transporting cultural norms from other communities into a specific community, but allowing them to use their own social cultural norms to define how they want to address the issues. The other thing that came out from the findings of the research was that because the traditional authorities were part of it, the Ghanaian culture is such that the traditional leaders are revered and what they say is what stands. And our traditional leaders are the custodians of our cultures and traditions. And so if they embrace an intervention, it makes it much easier for them to want to change certain cultural practices that they have if they understand the harmful effects of those cultural practices. So one of the things that worked for the intervention was the fact that the traditional leaders were on board. And at every community meeting, they would make affirmative pronouncements about how important the project was, how the changes in the communities has brought, a lot of development in terms of social development, individual development. And so they would tout this, development and praise what the combats were doing. So it made it so much easier. The other thing that we saw, the other lessons that we saw from this intervention did not only use women, uses only women. It looks as if we are pushing the men out. But we needed to be able to, support the intervention that was going on. So we used both men, women, and children were part of the intervention. That was one thing that made the intervention very successful. We did not dull out, we did not shut out the voices of the children. We listened to them. We did not shut out the voices of men. We listened to them. Neither did we shut out the voices of women. We listened to everybody. And all the voices that came from this, meetings and all of that were taken into consideration when having the conversations in the community. So it became much more easier. The other lessons that were learned from this intervention was the collaboration between the community and the state agencies, because the combat intervention has got a limit when it comes to certain cases, as I spoke about. When it comes to cases of defilements, that is the sexual abuse of children below the ages of 16, the community is not in a position to handle that. So there was a need to create a relationship between the community and the state agencies who had the mandate to provide support for this. So the combat will now create that link, lead these people to the state agencies who would then provide the necessary support. The other thing we did was to create an avenue where the state agencies, because of lack of funding, are not able to go into the communities as often as they are supposed to. But with our presence in the communities, we support them to come in every now and then to educate the communities on their mandates and to create a relationship with them so that the communities can have easy access to them. When they come in, they leave their telephone numbers, create relationships with them. And it's made it so much easier to be able, for this relationship to work. And that was one of the findings, that came out of the impact assessment that was done as to how the project has worked very well. I don't know, how much time do I have?
We have about 2 minutes left, Deborah, if you could begin to close.
So I'll quickly round up and say that the combat intervention has been bigger than when we started. When we began, it was a process, but currently, because of constant implementation, we've realized the impacts of the combat intervention and have, sold the idea to other people beyond Ghana for them to be able to use the intervention. And the structure of the training, and I'll still insist that the community-led and acceptance is what has made this project work. The fact that we don't dictate to the communities, the fact that we allow them to select their own people who will be trained, the fact that the people come from within the communities and go back to work in the communities is what has made this project work. And that is why we call it the rural response system. It is a rural response system. And so basically, this is just the little that I can say. I know I have just 10 minutes, so I didn't want to talk too much, but I'm sure that if there are any questions and clarifications that anyone would want regards to the combat intervention, I'll be more than pleased to give it. And also, when you Google the combat intervention, you would be able to get much. The DFID impact assessment is online. You can have access to it at any point and read on it. Thank you very much, Jody.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for that detailed explanation. I really appreciated how you involved everybody in the community. It wasn't just the women, it wasn't just the men, it was the women, men, and children. And that's really because violence prevention is everybody's concern, not just one particular group. So thank you so much for that. Please feel free to share resources and links in the chat. There are a couple of questions and comments. So I think moving on quickly, I am watching the time. It is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker for today. We have Associate Professor Oturo Hakaroa with us. He is the Director of Imagina, a applied research center at the University of de los Andes in Colombia. This center produces and disseminates evidence for the design and implementation of interventions, strategies, and public policies that promote the well-being of children and youth. He is also an associate professor at the University of Columbia, and his research agenda has focused on the design, implementation, and evaluation interventions that promote the development of human capital. He is a faculty affiliate and advisory board member at the Child Protection and Care Learning Network, an honorary fellow at Moray House School of Education at the University of Edinburgh in the UK, and a member of the Inspire working group. Arturo will share a little bit about the work on their social norms mentorship program. Arturo, please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm really happy. I'm really happy to have this space to share. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So you already introduced the Imagina Center, so I'm really happy for that. So today I'm going to share my experience as a facilitator and co-designer of the Social Norms Mentorship Program. But this is the work of a very large team. I'm going to mention some organizations and persons. But also I'm very lucky because there has been a very well and broad documentation of this process. So there are three different teams and products that have been done. These are all available. Some are at the Imagina Research Center's website, but some, if you need them, we can contact the authors. So I'm going to concentrate first on explaining what's the Social Norms Mentorship program, and then tell you a little bit about the pilot we did of this program in Colombia, back in Colombia, and what we learned from that process. The program main aim is to provide sustained assistance to NGOs, to non-governmental organizations, who want to integrate a social norms perspective into their work. So it is not, it is a way of integrating this framework, this approach to doing violence prevention, and what we have seen is that also it creates an internal capacity in the organizations to do other kind of prevention strategies, as Alessandra and Christine mentioned, just to improve lives of children, and it's designed to be implemented in low and middle income countries. The program is community-based and also integrates participatory research, participatory action research principles. We're going to see how. But it also has a lot of mechanisms to integrate best practices and well-established evidence in the violence prevention sphere. So the objectives are to create a diagnosis of the problem that wants to be solved, identifying the type of violence specifically to be prevented, to design data collection instruments and that help the community agents identify which are the prevalent social norms and other related risk factors related to violence. the third one is to implement an instrument and to implement that instrument and to do the analysis of the data that is collected. There is I'm going to show how a constant support on how to do this analysis and how to produce evidence from the information that is collected. And finally, the final objective is to get enough information to inform the design of an intervention based on the research that has been carried out by community agents, by the members of the NGOs, the local community members of the NGOs. The team is supported to arrive at the end to violence prevention intervention. So this program was the development of the social norms program was led by Ben Sislagi at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It had a lot of support from CARE USA and the Impact and Innovation Development Center, but also Los Andes, me and my team, and from other organizations were members of a technical review team that gave support, and then some of us continued in the implementation and next iteration of the improvement of the program. So how does it work? What's the structure? This is the general structure. So the program starts with a 5-day training that kicks off, then a 1-year social norms mentorship program. These 5 days can happen concentrated in a week, or as we did it in Colombia, because this was something that we worked out the agenda of this training and everything with the local NGO that we did the pilot. I'm going to present the NGO in a bit. We decided what was the best strategy in terms of the time available and etc. We actually did this during a semester, and we divided these meetings month to month, and we were advancing, mixing virtual and face-to-face activities. So the training is designed to inspire and catalyze learning on social norms, to engage the teams that are working in the field into getting a social norms perspective, to draw the evidence from their living experience. So it is the beginning of a learning journey on norms and social change. And after that, the mentorship process is designed to keep nurturing the knowledge and give them and accompany them in tasks that are opportunities for on-the-job application of the course content. The program is designed specifically to help organizations working to improve children's lives, but parts of it can be useful to anyone who's working on other issues that are important in improving the lives of all people. So the training is intended for a 5-day training, and all of the materials that I'm going to describe are available online for anyone who wants to do a similar training, draw some parts of it, use it in whole or in part, and to help to integrate social norms into their programming. The only thing, and it's an important caveat, the facilitation guides that are there are not designed to be used directly with community members or on for a train the trainers cascade. That's something that could be developed, but what's there has another intent. So what happens in the training? So I'm not going to read what happens in the day-to-day. There's a very detailed agenda. This is just a summary of what happens. The first day we work into understanding what social norms are and why they're important. The second one, we do it deeper diving how to diagnose or identify social norms and reference groups in their context. The third one, we work on understanding how norms change and what can change and what strategies can be used to bring about that change. The fourth day, we do a focus completely on how to do monitoring and evaluation on norm change. And finally, we do a course recap, discussing ethical issues and developing, this is very important, an action plan for the next year. What are we going to do in order to get to the final objective of having a homegrown intervention strategy based on social norms? So for that year of mentorship, there is a mentor who is going to provide ongoing technical assistance and guidance to help the organizations integrate social norms into the design and implementation of programs focused on child protection and well-being. During this process, the NGO develops the capacity to identify social norms and implement strategies to integrate social norms in their interventions. So actually, the 5-day training curriculum can be used for different audiences and purposes. This is the main track, that is the 5-day training for the NGO team to get the capacity within. But there are two other tracks, for instance, one that is for decision makers, for international local organizations, including donors. That could be like a half-day or full-day introduction to social norms. So you get an initial understanding of social norms. And another track that could be a 3-day training for technical advisors and consultants who have programmatic influence in their or other people's organizations. So you could do this in different ways. So it's important. On the right of this slide, you can see there's a facilitation guideline, and this gives you a lot of tools, and it's really prescriptive, but also it gives you a lot of flexibility of what do you want to do. No, actually in Colombia, we changed a lot of the activities. For instance, we have energizer activities. We did things that are more relevant for Colombian, for instance, less mindfulness, more music and dancing, or whatever adaptations that we could do. But if you need the first time, there's even scripted text that obviously you should revise and contextualize, but it is very well done. So the training integrates a diversity of instructional activities, including participatory discussions, games, reflection exercises, group work, and case studies. It's important. We draw a lot of case studies. The course does involve specific definitions and laying the common ground. We have to have a definition of social norm. These unwritten rules regulating what actions are acceptable, appropriate, and obligatory in a given situation shared by members of a group. You have to define a reference group, sanction, descriptive norm. There's a lot of definitions, but it is only to be able to start doing this collaborative work. So the social norms program aims to be theory light. It's not a deep academic exercise. It focuses on practical implications of the theory. So what do you need to know in order to have appropriate design, to do the intervention design? So sessions have been designed to allow significant time to reflect and translate key takeaways and messages into participants' lived experiences. This is something really important because it offers opportunities to share best practice and lessons learned, which is going to fit in the design, because it's a way of having a completely bottoms-up approach and something that is really contextualized. So this is the design. We did an implementation of the social norms programming in alliance with Fundación Juanfe Foundation. Juanfe Foundation is an NGO that has been working since 2002, providing services to teenage mothers from a very vulnerable context in Colombia. It's actually working 2 places in Colombia right now, but it has also transferred their curriculum and technology to other places, Dominican Republic, Panama. There are other places that are working with them. And what they do is they created this 360 degree model. It has served more than 4,000 young women. In Colombia, the teenage pregnancy is a very important topic. The adolescent fertility rate triples the average observed for OECD countries, and it almost doubles the rate for middle-income countries. So it's a very important problem that we are working on. So it's a problem because the early pregnancies in Colombia are concentrated completely in households in context of greater adversity. Almost half of adolescents between 15 and 19 who are already mothers or are pregnant for the first time are at the bottom levels of the wealth index. So this model from the Juanfe Foundation is based on the comprehensive provision of healthcare and educational services, and then connecting these young mothers to the formal labor market in order for them to have like a income source and start building a path to break intergenerational poverty replication. Yeah. So these working with this NGO, I was working with the NGO before. We already had very strong data. We did a study in which we used the violence against children and youth surveys in this population in Cartagena only, one of the cities, the one that is up north. And we identified that 58% of Juanfe's participants, young mothers, reported having experienced physical, psychological, or sexual violence, or a combination, before they turn 18. So the very high prevalence of violence. So as a result, we started thinking on how to develop a prevention strategy. And this came perfectly together with the intention of the social norms program. So we did the social norms mentoring program. These are the dates. We had a lot of milestones. The work was incredible, having all of the evidence from the initial start completely contextualized. So we had to I'm going to jump because of time to the results. What we did is we collected data from the communities with the facilitators from the Juanfe Foundations, or still are members of the community. They did interviews and focus groups to collect data and to understand and identify and understand social norms and other factors, risk factors. Then, with the help of the mentor, Laura Leono Karim was there, and Maria Cecilia de Dios was there. I'm mentioning my colleagues that work with the teams. They got to the final diagnosis of the information that finally created the strategy that was proposed by the foundation. They decided that what the problem they wanted to tackle was gender-based violence, and they decided that they wanted, drawing from the data, that they needed a multi-strategy prevention, having 5 components. This echoes what my colleagues have already mentioned. It's not only about information delivery, that's necessary but not sufficient. So it has at the end of the day, we had these 5 components that were the information delivery was completely integrated throughout the 360-degree model, that it's a 1.5-year program, delivering information that explain what's gender-based violence, under what circumstances one becomes a victim of the GBV, what are the services or care routes available. The second part of the strategy focused on peer role models. They created this Juanfe ambassadors program that were alumni from the program that provide information and psychosocial support to peers in their communities. They represented the foundation and gave like a initial information and support in when they were visiting in their community. The third component is a psychosocial training, providing these young women with knowledge, tools, and support to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. So the idea is here that we gave them the capacity to identify and understand the risks related to GBV, to mitigate the consequences, to promote protection, to foster the development of support networks. So they worked on emotional intelligence, life projects, and other protective factors. A safe space strategy was also part of the bigger strategy, creating an empathetic, caring, and respectful environment throughout the institution for young women who were victims of GBV, and increasing the early identification of risk factors, right? And finally, a strategy to work with the families and or the intimate partners. So this was done through home visiting and workshops. This was what the result. Eventually, we hope to have like an evaluation on how this is going. This has been implemented for we're completing the first year of the strategy being on the ground. So I hope that soon we could do another monitoring and evaluation iteration to improve and to share the what happened here with the community. So thank you. Yeah, this work was being supported by the United States Agency for International Development and by all of the members that I mentioned before. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Arturo. That was really, really interesting. And I will say that a one-year mentorship is quite an investment of time and resources. And it really just goes to show the impact that can have. So thank you so much. I am watching the time, and we do want to get a couple of question and answers, questions, comments. So I think I will now open up to the floor. I have noted a couple of questions and comments in the chat, which is great. But would anyone like to raise their hand? You are more than welcome to switch your camera on, and you can introduce yourself, who you are representing, and go ahead with your question to whichever speaker you like. So I will open to the floor now. With any questions? I did see a question in the chat that I thought was quite interesting, and I think it was in relation to your presentation, Deborah. It's from Michael Green. I don't know if you are still in the audience, but Deborah, what impacts do religious beliefs have in reinforcing norms that facilitate violence against women and children? And I had a similar question. When you are doing the combat intervention in the community and you're having the conversations where you're talking about cultural practices, how is that received? Because you have to be very careful how you frame that conversation, and then following on from Michael's question.
Okay, thank you very much, Jody. I think because of the short time that I had, I really couldn't delve so much into how the whole structure is. So one thing that we do when we enter into a community, what I had mentioned was traditional and religious leaders are engaged. So if you don't get a buy-in from these people, it's going to be very difficult because, as we all know, apart from the traditions and cultures, religion, as has been said by Karl Marx, is the opium of the masses, and people are so entrenched in religious beliefs. And unfortunately, a lot of the religious beliefs further, entrench some of these practices of how, an intimate relationship should look like. And it is some of these beliefs and practices within the religious system which result in the kind of abuses that we see, and the kind of religious practices that also encourage for children to be abused. Cultural religious practices that would allow, excuse me to say in quote, for things to happen within the church, the religious belief of, oh, pray over issues, even when you go and you report to your pastor and says, oh, my husband is beating me and he's not paying the school fees of the children, and we are not able to have enough to eat, and the pastor says, oh, go back and pray, the Lord will make a way. So because of some of these things, we always involve every stakeholder. We don't leave out the religious leaders. We involve them in our inception meetings that we have. One thing that we do is that in our inception meetings, we try to bring all of them together to have a conversation. Okay. When the combats come for training, one of the first things we do, the very first day they step into the room, is, can you identify some of the cultural practices that happen in your community, which to you, as a man, a woman, you believe infringes on your rights to exist? So they list all of them and we put them on the wall somewhere, because we are going to come back and have a conversation about that. So after they've been trained on gender, after they've been trained on violence, after they've been trained on all of these things, we now come back and would say, what do you think about the things that you have put down? What can we do about it? What are some of the advocacy points we want to have with your community leaders? What are the conversations that need to go on? So when they go back, they are armed with information about how to approach the issue. One thing we tell them, that change is not overnight. So don't go flexing your muscles, thinking that because you have been impacted or empowered with information, the change that you have experienced within the past 2 weeks will be the same as you go back into the community. We make them understand that it is a process. So when you go in, everybody would attack the fact that you are coming to attack the cultural practices that the communities have abided by for so many years. But what you want them to see is bring it home. Okay, this practice of marrying off a child at the age of, let's say, 10, 12, 13, 14, when they have not reached their self-actualization, what does it mean for the progress of your child? We are in a society where things are moving. You need to be educated. You need to be able to, exist. But if you marry your child off, what are the implications for that child? So you want to get them to have a conversation. Oh, I think I saw Jane's daughter the last time. She's now a teacher. She's a lawyer, and I would want my daughter to be the same. We say, yes. So what is preventing you is this practice that children need to be married off at a certain age. So as a community, what do you think can be done? And with this program, we have supported communities to come up with bylaws in the communities that say that at a point in time, and we want them to be able to come up with the solutions themselves. And they can only do that if they understand that there is a problem. So yes, those conversations are very difficult to have, but it must be had in a very, not that, most times people think that the people who are coming from the cities come to dump information on them. Oh, they think they know too much. They think they understand how we live. They think we understand how we function. We don't go in with that kind of attitude. We say, tell us what the practices are, because already the people who came for the training have pointed out those practices, so we know. So as we are going in to support them with the advocacy, the combat with the advocacy, we let them do the talking. If we feel that there are any questions that are beyond them, then we would come in and now support with answers. But we try not to lead the conversation so that it doesn't look as if we are telling them what to do. but we let their own people lead the conversation, and together they are able to come up with, solutions as to how they can go about the cultural norms that are, harmful to the community.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for that really excellent explanation. Christine, I do see your hand, but before I get to you, you will see a poll evaluating today's event will probably pop up on your screen. It will take a couple of seconds to complete. This just helps us to create better events in the future. Christine, please go ahead.
Thanks, Jody. I don't think very much more needs to be said on this subject, but because I think that my colleague Deborah covered this really well, but I just wanted to offer a couple of reflections from UNICEF's perspectives of the importance of religious leaders, excuse me, in shifting norms and values. I mean, first and foremost, obviously, the first question that we ask ourselves is, whether or not this is a secular or religious society, and what's the context in which we're operating in, and if it is a society that is a very religious, then naturally religious leaders are a key reference group, and that's important because we know that behavior is affected not just by what we think is important, but what we think important others in our life think is important. And in that case, religious leaders can become a really important stakeholder in this discussion. I think what's really important to bear in mind is that, of course, in all scriptures that we know of, or maybe that's not the correct thing to say, but at least in many of the main religions in the world, there are elements of scripture that can sometimes underpin harmful behaviors, but there are also huge amounts of elements of scriptures that are very pro-social, progressive and protective. And it's really about amplifying those positive elements that kind of underpin cultural and religious norms that support progression and rights that we want to try and pull out. And finally, just to say that as much as this is super important because of the kind of local ownership that it enables, it's also very strategic because religious leaders are such an important reference group that help us to go to scale with norms change initiatives. So bringing religious leaders on board is a really key part of our strategy within UNICEF and key to a lot of the work that we've done across the world. So great question. Over.
Thank you very much, Christine. Does anyone have any other questions? Michael, not to put you on the spot, but I'm not sure if you raised your hand when you switched your camera on. Yes. Mpo, you can go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
All right, it's Mpo from South Africa. I work in a small organization with the children at school, teaching them life skills, empowering them, trying to make them, to be able to stand up for themselves and the girls. So my question is around the strategies and approaches that we're using in South Africa, or maybe the interventions that we are using. And it seems it's just a drop in the ocean because every day we get, the cases of, violence against children and women. So I'm asking myself, what is it that we are missing? What can we do so that we can feel that at least we are making an impact? And I was interviewed today about the 16 days of activism. If, I think, we are being successful and, the interventions and all. And I'm saying that it seems there is something that we are missing because every day we hear of the stories and the cases, and I'm in the WhatsApp group of other women who are dealing, or addressing this problem in their communities. And really, we hear stories every day. And it seems as if there is little that you are doing, to be successful in this. How can we feel better about it, about the interventions?
Thanks, Mpo. And yes, I'm sure we can all relate to constantly feeling this way, especially in this line of work. And I guess the question is, the interventions that do work, how can we take them to scale, especially in a country with high levels of violence like South Africa? And I guess that is one way that we can start thinking about that. But unfortunately, I don't know if anyone has the answer to that question, but thank you so much for your reflection. Any other questions and comments? Yes, Lato, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for this. It's been very informative. I liked that presentation from Colombia about the training on social norms and behaviors. I don't know whether it's available. Can it be made available for South Africa? Because I think it can work, you know, especially in our traditional communities. And also for you know, to deal with this teenage pregnancy issue. I think we can, you know, copy the model that they're using in Colombia. I'm sure it can work for us. I'm in one of the committees that are trying to deal with this issue, and we want to locate it at you know, at a local level. We want communities to be the ones who are leading this. So if you know, there are any there's anything that you can share with regards to that, and also regarding the training, who is it meant for, and is it meant for facilitators, and who comes up with you know, yeah, can I get more information about it and how it's funded? Who? Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So in this case, the team that participated in the training and that was in the research were members from the psychosocial support team within Juanfe Foundation. I missed to mention that. So it was members that provided psychosocial support to all of the participants in the 360-degree model. So they were in a very good place to incorporate this knowledge, but also because they were going to be in charge of then implementing the prevention strategy. Well, they were the best team to develop it, no? Because they knew what was feasible, what was scalable, what was, yeah, what was the scope they could reach. So it is meant for the teams within the NGOs. This one of the lessons that we learned is that you need a very deep commitment from the NGO in order for this to work, because it's going to take time, no? Not only the training, but then collecting the data, analyzing the data, no? Doing the interviews and the focal groups, and then trying to understand what comes up, and then with the support of the mentorship program, getting to intervention. The materials, the facilitation guides are open sourced. I can share the whole learning documentation around the pilot. Happy to do that. The program from the Juanfe Foundation, I'm not sure how open is their curriculum, but there's a lot of documentation around it, and probably they would be happy to talk to you. So yes, I can provide more information.
Thank you very much, Arturo. If any of those could be added via links in the chat, it would be very, very helpful if it's available to you right now. I am watching the time, but I think we have time for one more question. I see a question from Michael in the chat. Do federal child protection and prevention agencies have or can have a synergistic impact on the programs discussed? And this is for any speaker. Michael, perhaps you want to elaborate, or Christina, are you?
Jody, I'm happy to come in and offer initial reflections. I think the answer to this is absolutely yes. I think, you know, simplistically, we tend to think about norms change taking place at the community level, perhaps conventionally taking place through strategic comms at the population level. But we tend to think about community engagement approaches where we're generating public discourse, and that is super important. But actually, norms are held within child protection systems as well, you know, and there are people underneath these systems who are members of the public and who carry with them to work their own attitudes, beliefs, and are shaped by societal norms. And so the impact that these kind of institutions have, that, you know, I guess norms can permeate into systems, into laws, into policy. And so, yes, norms change definitely requires working at these kind of systemic levels as well, although that's not often kind of our first thought. But I think it's a really good question. Things like thinking about how we improve interpersonal communication of frontline workers, how we reduce bias in social service workforces are really important considerations when we're thinking about, for example, uptake of services for the prevention of violence or response to violence in the community. And things like legislative change are really important normative signals to population levels about change that's required. So whilst we're talking about this N in the strategy in isolation today, really these are very much kind of complementary initiatives that work across complex systems. Over, Jody.
Thank you very much, Christine. I think that's a really important point. And the strategies and inspires they're supposed to work together and they complement each other. I am watching the time. We do have about 1 minute left. I just wanted to see if there's any final question or comment from our audience before we close. Any final questions, reflections? Okay, well, I think in that case, I think we can wrap up. Thank you very much for all the wonderful links and resources in the chat. We have come to the end of our time together today, and I want to give a very, very big thank you to all our speakers for your valuable insights and for the hard work that you are doing to prevent violence against children across the world. Thank you so much for our audience, for your engagement, for your attention. This recording will be available on the Institute for Security Studies website. You can access it there, and please feel free to get in touch if you would like more information or resources. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.